He was a dashing young salesman on the fast track to success.
He had a personality that most people tend to gravitate toward.
A lot of women wanted to spend some time with him.
But when police make a shocking discovery, they'll soon wonder if this playboy had been flirting with disaster.
Everybody was crying. There was police everywhere.
That was no secret that, Eric liked the ladies and the ladies liked Eric.
It looked like a suicide, but there were others who believed it was murder.
To uncover the truth, investigators will follow a twisted trail where first impressions can be deceiving and looks can kill.
I couldn't understand what the guy was saying. It wasn't an argument. It just sounded urgent.
She didn't really see who the person was that gave him the drugs.
So this must have been someone he trusted, someone that had access to his apartment.
Anger, jealousy, revenge, disrespect. The oldest motives in the book.
This was not an accident, not an accidental discharge. This was an execution.
June 6th, 2012. It's another pristine morning in the upscale Washington, D.C. suburb of Bethesda, Maryland. But while most of the city's residents are making their daily commute to the nation's capital, 34-year-old car salesman Eric Samoa is noticeably absent from work.
Eric Samoa was a responsible person. He showed up at work every day.
Eric hasn't showed up for work again?
No, sir, and I can't get him to answer his phone.
That's not like Eric.
He's not reporting to work. By day 2, the employer has not heard from Eric and calls the family to find out if Eric is okay.
Top salesman, a guy who loves his job, falls off the face of the earth.
This is Eric's boss at work.
Eric's boss contacts his family members to try to determine his whereabouts, but no one has heard from him in a couple of days.
Eric is a young person, and young people live with their phones attached to them. It would not be like Eric to not respond to the calls of his family.
The alarm bells start to go off that maybe something's amiss and maybe police should go to his apartment and see what's up.
That afternoon, police visit Eric's luxury high-rise apartment in nearby Silver Spring, where family members are waiting nervously in the lobby.
Hi, are you Eric's family?
Yes.
If you'll just wait down here, we'll come back down and let you know what we find, okay?
When the police go to the apartment, the door had to be unlocked by management to allow the police access when he did not respond to the knock.
Eric? Eric?
The apartment is calm, and in the bedroom is Eric, laying in his bed, under his sheets, with a bullet in his head.
The 2 officers who initially arrived to check on him thought he had committed suicide.
Doesn't look like there's much blood or struggle. He may have done this himself.
I was at our police headquarters. I got a call from one of our patrol supervisors, and he told me that there was a suicide at a high-rise in Silver Spring.
But why would a young man who had the world at his fingertips take his own life? That's only the first of many mysteries investigators will have to unravel.
This was a case that had everything. Mystery, multiple lovers, drugs, suicide, and it wasn't something that was gonna be solved quickly or without a lot of luck.
Born in 1977 to immigrants from Ghana and raised with his 4 siblings in Springfield, Virginia, Eric Samoa seemed destined for success from a young age.
He was an athlete. He was very charismatic, very smart, and very ambitious.
He pretty much started out as a entrepreneur at a young age with his own lawn mowing service.
When he graduated from high school, he went right into the auto sales business. He loved cars, and he loved selling cars, and he had a knack for it.
Hey, how are you? How you doing?
It didn't take long for Eric to rise to the top of his field.
So I see you checking out one of our finest right here.
He begins to work for a car dealership in Bethesda, specializing in high-end cars, Jaguars and Range Rovers. He becomes #1 at that particular dealership.
He was very articulate, very personable, and people liked him. He had the it factor.
I've been doing this long enough, I can look at a person and see what's right for them.
Okay.
This car is perfect for you.
And it wasn't just on the showroom floor where Eric's charisma paid dividends.
Sounds good. I would love to take it for a test drive.
Oh, yeah?
Eric Samoa was a tall, handsome fella. He was obviously well-liked by the ladies in his community.
Good-looking guy, pleasing on the eye, warm smile. Yeah, he's a ladies' man.
Some say he took a different woman home every night.
Despite his playboy reputation, Eric was a family man at heart and was always on the lookout for that one true love.
Eric wanted to be able to get married to someone he loved, have children, start his own business, and really take off from there.
Then, one day in 2011, a beautiful businesswoman was browsing the cars at the dealership and immediately caught Eric's eye.
Hello. I'm Eric.
I'm Denise.
Hey, Denise. Can I help you with anything?
Yes, I'm definitely interested. What can you tell me about
When Eric met Denise, the sparks flipped.
This car would look perfect on you. You look so beautiful in this car.
They met while she was buying a Jaguar at the dealership, and they started dating.
So you think I would look beautiful in this car?
You would look beautiful in this car.
Okay, so this is
you're
the car.
beautiful outside the car, but in the car.
Though there was a bit of an age difference, Eric asked Denise out on the spot.
Denise was years his senior, which probably means she was bringing something to the table that Eric needed.
After Eric and Denise's first date, the relationship went from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat.
Denise described it as a very loving relationship. Eric would constantly be at her house. She would be at his house at times, or his apartment at times.
And what are we doing tonight?
I think we should stay in, watch a movie, have some food.
That sounds like a good idea.
Though their sexual chemistry was undeniable, there was more to Eric and Denise's relationship. They also had the makings of a successful business team.
In addition to selling cars and being very successful at that, Eric was also starting to develop his own business. He was starting a nursing staffing company, and he saw that as the next wave as the healthcare industry was exploding, and he wanted to get in on that and make money.
The relationship was very good, actually. She's in business, so she would help him out in his business affairs and was kind of guiding him into his future.
Eric Samoa seemed to have it all: looks, money, love, and an entrepreneurial spirit that was poised to carry him to even greater heights.
By 2011, Eric is on a roll. He's not just selling upscale cars. He's in the game where you want to be.
But on June 6, 2012, the same young man who was on such a roll now lies dead in his bedroom, a single bullet in his head.
The investigators thought it might be a suicide because of the way his body was positioned in the bed with the covers pulled up as if he had done it himself.
Maybe he had overextended himself. Maybe he was in debt.
But soon some serious questions would arise about that theory and leave police wondering if Eric's death was more nefarious than mere suicide.
There's no gun in the bedroom. There's no gun anywhere in the apartment. Just a shell casing and a dead body.
In the spring of 2012, handsome car salesman and aspiring entrepreneur Eric Samoa seemed like he was in the prime of his life.
Eric was a handsome guy. He was well-built, and he had charisma. And he became involved with a lady named Denise. Eric had it all.
But on June 6th, the discovery of Eric's body inside his luxury apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, has police wondering if Eric's so-called perfect life was just a mirage.
It looked like Eric, for whatever reason, had decided to commit suicide.
Doesn't appear to be any other wounds.
Eric had a single gunshot wound to the head. There was no exit wound. The blood spatter was very minimal. There was a .380 shell casing on top of his bed. He was tucked in, his head was on the pillow. It looked very peaceful.
According to the medical examiner, Eric had been dead for approximately 36 hours.
While investigators continue to examine the scene, officers head downstairs to speak to Eric's family.
We're so sorry to tell you this, but at this point, it looks like Eric committed suicide.
The family became visibly and very emotional and upset. They loved him, and it was heartbreaking.
Though they are distraught, Eric's family refuses to believe he took his own life.
They were just like, no way would Eric do that. He loved his life. There is no way in the world he would commit suicide.
I know this is a really difficult time for you, but is there any problems he might have had in his life, financial or otherwise, that might have led to this?
He was not depressed. He was not angry. He was probably at the top of his game in terms of what people that age would want to have accomplished by that time.
While Eric's family finds the thought of suicide inconceivable, upstairs, investigators make a crucial discovery.
When they get there, they start to carefully canvass the bedroom. The first thing they find is a shell casing. What would you expect to find after that? If it's a suicide? A gun. There's no gun.
They discover that there is no weapon. That makes it pretty hard for it to have been a suicide, so the police start to shift their thinking a little bit.
So right there, I knew Eric was murdered.
With Eric Samoa's death officially labeled a homicide, the next step for investigators is to pinpoint a motive.
When we first entered the apartment, everything appeared to be in order. There was no signs of any kind of break-in.
Nothing was disturbed in the home, and there was no forced entry at all. The door was locked.
Though the murder weapon is nowhere to be found, the pristine condition of Eric's apartment offers insight into the killer's identity.
Whoever got into his home, there was at least an initial thought they must have known him. He was comfortable enough to have them come into the house without having to break in.
As they say, before you go looking for the outlaws, you look for the in-laws.
But who in Eric's life would want him dead? Police turn to Eric's family for answers.
Is there anyone that he dated on a regular basis?
There were plenty of women.
I think it would be fair to say that Eric was what we call a player.
There were a number of different potential people that you might want to look at to say, okay, well, wait a minute.
Is this some sort of love triangle that went wrong? Is that why he's dead?
As they continue speaking to Eric's family, police realize there's one woman in Eric's life who would have been hurt the most by his alleged infidelity.
There was this one, Denise.
Yes. Now, Denise thought that she and Eric were exclusive.
All this fooling around.
You're my main woman.
Main
I've
woman.
seen other women.
Main woman.
She was the main girlfriend and a fine young lady who thought the relationship was going to continue, but that was starting to deteriorate.
Now, I've had enough. Women in and out of this apartment like this is Grand Central Station or something.
Eric and Denise went through a rocky period where I don't think he was willing to let go of some of his promiscuous lifestyle, and she just wasn't the type of woman to want to deal with that.
Could Denise's frustration with Eric be a motive for murder? As investigators start to entertain that theory, a surprise discovery sends the case in a shocking new direction.
They began to wonder, well, who is this person that he calls somewhat frequently with a Mississippi number?
It's been 2 days since Eric Samoa was shot dead inside the bedroom of his high-rise apartment in suburban Maryland. Because there's little evidence of a struggle or signs of forced entry, investigators believe the killer was likely someone Eric knew and perhaps even trusted.
The police began to focus on who could have possibly done this to this particular young man. The first person that would come to mind would be a love interest.
According to Eric's family, businesswoman Denise Jenkins was Eric's primary girlfriend, and she allegedly had access to his apartment.
The police learned that the relationship is on the out.
Apparently, he couldn't keep his hands off other women, and that was becoming a problem.
But was Denise so angry at Eric that she would resort to murdering him? On June 8, 2012, detectives bring Denise in for questioning.
I think you know why you're here right now.
Yes.
So were you and Eric having relationship issues?
According to Denise, she called Eric on the night of June 4th, just 48 hours before his body was discovered, for what she claims was a final goodbye.
We just decided to part ways. We had nothing in common the night.
She said they spoke on the phone around 2 o'clock in the morning, where they said their goodbyes. They were having a conversation about going their separate ways. So it stood out to me as possibly being a motive, that maybe there was a little bit more to this conversation, and they did break up that day. And then she decided to come back to the apartment and kill him.
But when detectives continue to press Denise, she doesn't wither under questioning. In fact, she asserts that her and Eric's problems weren't really rooted in infidelity.
He wanted children. I'm beyond that age.
She was older than him. She didn't want to go through having children and starting a family at that point, whereas he did.
So she cooperated with us fully. She let us have her phone. She seemed to be very concerned about Eric being murdered. She showed genuine feelings for Eric.
Yeah, this was all over the phone. You never actually went to his apartment?
No, I had no reason to. Like I said, we said our final goodbyes over the phone.
You still have a key for Eric's apartment?
She told me that once upon a time she had a key to Eric's apartment, although she claimed that she gave it back.
Denise was very forthcoming with the police. She met with them several times to be interviewed. She was interviewed at length. Her phone couldn't put her in the area. Ultimately, she wasn't the person that was responsible for this.
With Denise Jenkins stricken from the suspect list, investigators turn their attention to Eric's many other female friends.
He had girls that he took out on Friday night, and Eric had girls that he took out on Saturday night.
Detectives pull Eric's phone records, hoping to narrow down their suspect pool.
They go through his phone records, and they see a series of phone numbers and texts that are associated with a Mississippi area code.
They began to wonder, well, who is this person that he calls somewhat frequently with a Mississippi number?
According to phone company records, the number is registered to a woman named Katrina Ben. A background check by police reveals that Katrina recently moved from Mississippi to the D.C. area. In fact, she lives in the same luxury apartment complex as Eric Samoa. Unsure which apartment is Katrina's, detectives decide to stake out the building's parking garage.
On June 9th, we were actually looking through the garage, the apartment building, just looking at each level of the garage, and on the 7th floor of the garage, I observed a vehicle with a Mississippi plate, and it was registered to Katrina Ben.
45 minutes later, detectives see a young woman approach the vehicle.
So we approached her, and I said, "Are you Miss Ben?" And she said, "Yeah."
Man, we're police officers. We're here to talk to you about Eric.
Eric who?
Eric Samoa.
And there was this long pause, and she said, "Why? What happened?"
Ma'am, Eric's been murdered.
What?
And so I said, hey, well, we'd like to talk to you further. So they bring in for an interview.
At the station, detectives learn the 34-year-old Mississippi native has been residing in the same apartment building as Eric for the past few months.
Katrina Ben was from Mississippi. She was a traveling nurse. She moved every 3 months, and she lived in 20 different states in the past 5 years.
Katrina Ben is a very smart woman. She graduated from Jackson State in Mississippi. She's an oncology nurse. She was brought to the Washington, D.C. area on a contract to work at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda.
While Katrina certainly has an impressive resume, investigators want to know her connection to Eric Samoa.
She said her and Eric met a few weeks ago in a building.
Oh, hey, excuse me, are you a nurse?
I am.
He came up to her because she was wearing a nursing outfit. and he began a conversation about starting a nursing business. And that's how they met.
We need to hang out.
Okay.
I got a nice spot.
Oh, I would love that.
They had, in essence, what would sometimes be termed as date night, in terms of sports running on maybe Sunday night or Monday night.
They were both basketball fans, and at some point they started hanging out in each other's apartments, and their relationship became intimate.
If that makes sense.
Katrina's connection to Eric certainly makes her a person of interest, but detectives aren't sure she fits the profile of a killer.
She's a professional woman. She's bright, she's educated, she carries herself in almost a very formal, very serious way.
Katrina's very composed when she talks to the detectives, and she's a professional lady. She doesn't seem to be suspicious per se.
While Katrina's demeanor seems convincing, police don't stop there.
Do you own a gun?
No.
Have you ever fired a gun?
No.
They start asking her questions about whether or not she owned a gun.
I've asked her at that point whether she's ever owned any guns or ever fired a gun, and the answer to both questions was no. And her tone was as if she was almost offended by that question.
Still, the most important question is the one detectives ask Katrina next.
They want to know when Katrina last saw Eric.
What Katrina says will have police pondering a new, far more menacing motive behind Eric Samoa's death.
He was involved with some dark characters, people who operated in the illegal drug trade in and around Silver Spring.
I kind of understand what the guy was saying. It wasn't an argument. It just sounded urgent.
Three days after Eric Samoa was found shot to death inside his upscale Silver Spring apartment, investigators are trying to determine if his neighbor-turned-lover, Katrina Ben, had anything to do with his death.
Katrina was the girl Eric would call every now and then, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Sometimes she'd stay over.
But after speaking with Katrina, investigators have a hard time believing she committed any crime. What they want to know now is if she has any insight into who might want Eric dead.
She starts to give this incredible story of how the night that he was killed, that she actually spent some time with him.
Katrina said a little after 9 o'clock on Monday, June 4th, she went down to Eric's apartment to watch an NBA game.
They were watching a basketball game, and at some point, Eric said, I want to get some weed.
So, a few minutes passed by, and he calls somebody else. This person is either Will or Whip. I don't know. It sounded like he was saying Will at first.
Katrina said that she doesn't smoke weed, she's a nurse, but he said, it's just down the street. Why don't we go? It's not a big deal.
According to Katrina, she went with him as they drove to a neighborhood to purchase weed from a man that she said she didn't know.
Katrina says that Eric finalized the deal on his cell phone while slowly pulling his car over on a dimly lit side street.
I'm looking at him, we're talking about something. Before I can even turn and see who's getting in the car, the back door opened.
What's up, man? What's up, man? You got it?
Mm-hmm.
So the guy gets in the car, and it was real quick. The whole deal, whatever they did. Eric had money, he gave him the money.
Woo! Hindu Kush, baby.
Really? Can we just go?
Katrina says the drug purchase went off without a hitch. However, her and Eric's night didn't end there.
Back at his apartment, they relaxed, they made love. She eventually says she woke up and heard some commotion.
I came over here and I expect for you to have my money.
So when I woke up to him talking to somebody, and it was a guy.
She was looking through the door into the living room, and she said she observed what she believed to be the same guy, this drug dealer, that was now in Eric's apartment.
I think he owed him money because he was saying, I have to go to the ATM, I'll go in a minute. And I kind of understand what the guy was saying. It wasn't an argument, it just sounded urgent.
Katrina says that at that point, she went back to bed, but she was so unnerved by the exchange she witnessed, she couldn't fall back asleep. and after a couple more hours, decided it was time to leave.
Around 5:30 a.m., she got up, got dressed, went back to her apartment.
When she left, Eric was in the bedroom, and the drug dealer was in the living room, and he, in essence, almost pushed her out of the door when he tried to close it behind her.
Well, good night.
Yeah, whatever.
That's the last time she saw him.
For investigators, Katrina's story is eye-opening. But is it the truth?
She admits being in his apartment. She admits that she left, but she says, look, as I'm leaving, I noticed there's somebody else in the apartment. They do background on her. They're looking at her. There's nothing that screams she's lying.
So we concentrated on this drug dealer.
What detectives had was a vague description of this guy, and Katrina believed his name to be Will or Whip.
Detectives pour through Eric's phone records a second time.
And the same number keeps popping up the morning of the murder.
And sure enough, they find something.
The guy that Katrina mentioned?
Phone records lead them to a man named William.
William Watts, to be precise. Could this be the same Will that Katrina alleged was in Eric's apartment in the early morning hours of June 5th? That's what detectives intend to find out.
We set up surveillance on his residence. He was seen leaving in his car. He was followed to a neighboring county where he basically was involved in the drug deal of a large quantity of marijuana. And at that point, he was arrested for that drug deal.
William is taken to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, where Detective Reuben interviews him.
I interviewed him about Eric. And initially, he denied even knowing Eric, selling to Eric, and not even knowing what this is about.
I don't know anybody named Eric.
Give it up, William. We know you sell to him.
At some point, he basically confessed to selling Eric a little bit of marijuana that night.
I saw him with some lady I'd never seen before.
Did you go to his apartment that night?
Man, I don't even know where he lives.
William Watts is adamant he had nothing to do with Eric's murder, but investigators aren't so sure. They obtain a search warrant for William's apartment 24 hours later and make a shocking discovery inside. One that seems to corroborate Katrina Ben's insinuations about the last night of Eric's life.
Found a safe.
Inside the safe was a .380 handgun.
380. I think we got him.
At the murder scene, detectives found a .380 caliber shell casing. Now, they're really intrigued.
I'm gonna bag the weapon, and we'll take the rest of that in as evidence.
Got it.
We're kind of looking at Detective Reuben, and Detective Reuben is looking at us, and we're saying, she is telling the truth. Oh my gosh, this is our guy.
The gun is sent to the crime lab for testing. And the results aren't what detectives expected.
The ballistics come back off of his gun. It is not a match to the bullet that was found in Eric Samoa.
Another thing that the police found when they were looking into the drug dealer was that his phone records did not pinpoint him being in the location that Eric was in at the time of his death.
I mean, we really had nothing. I mean, after this, the drug dealer checked out. His gun wasn't our murder weapon.
With no murder weapon and no physical evidence tying William Watts to the scene, detectives have hit a dead end. But even as the case goes cold, they refuse to give up the search for Eric Samoa's killer.
I always thought about Eric. I felt like this was my job, to bring Eric justice.
May 2013. It's now been 11 months, and detectives in Montgomery County, Maryland have yet to make an arrest in the shooting death of suave car salesman and notorious ladies' man, Eric Samoa.
They had looked at Eric's long-term girlfriend, Denise. They had looked at Katrina Ben, as well as a local drug dealer.
So after this, we kind of went nowhere. We had no other leads.
But as the months have gone by, the case has continued to eat away at Detective Reuben.
I felt like I wasn't doing my job, like finding the person that killed him. So I would continuously pick up that case and work on a thing here or a thing there.
One avenue Reuben decides to explore seems like a long shot.
He decides to check with the evidence lab and see how many pistols were handed in or recovered in Montgomery County.
I quickly figured out that that was just an enormous task. So I contacted the ATF, and I got ATF reports on all guns recovered in Montgomery County. And I narrowed it down to 380s for the last year. And it was about 60 guns.
He went through report after report after report.
The first 58 reports were dead ends.
But on the second to last report, Detective Rubin strikes gold.
It was a handgun that was recovered on the side of 495, which is the Washington Beltway. It was within 1.5 miles of Eric's residence. It was recovered the day after we recovered Eric's body.
The gun was evidently turned in by a tourist traveling on 495. And they're in rush hour traffic, it's bumper to bumper, and he's driving along left side of the roadway, and he sees the remnants of a gun.
Now, the handgun, this 380, is partially disassembled, but the serial numbers are there.
When Detective Rubin runs the serial number, he's stunned.
The original purchaser of that gun was from Mississippi. So that all kinds of alarm bells went in my head. I knew Katrina was from Mississippi.
Though the gun wasn't able to be linked to Eric Samoa's sometimes girlfriend, Katrina Ben, Detective Rubin and his team believe it's more than just a coincidence.
It had initially been purchased within 10 miles of Miss Ben's hometown in Mississippi. Detective Rubin flies out to Mississippi, and he goes to the initial purchaser of the gun. And that person said, well, yeah, I purchased the gun, but then I sold it to this pawn shop.
Even though I'm a police officer, I still had misconceptions on how easy or hard it is to track guns, but it wasn't easy at all.
It had been purchased and resold 5 times at various pawn shops in Mississippi.
So I had to go to each individual and basically talk him into telling me about what happened to the gun.
And as they're tracking these people down, trying to get them to cooperate, say, hey, look, you're not in trouble. We're just trying to get to the bottom of who was the final owner of this gun.
The pawn shop where the gun was purchased for the 5th and final time is in the tiny town of Columbia, Mississippi.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good.
How can I help you?
My name's Detective Rubin, and I'm trying to track down a gun that was purchased here a while back.
That place looked like a shack.
You mind if I look at your records?
Yeah, I don't mind at all.
Some pawn shops or gun stores had computerized records. These guys did everything by hand, and they were very helpful. But all their records were in the back of the shed.
There may not be much left. The rats have been chewing on them.
Lead the way.
Sure.
They basically said good luck finding those records because half of them were eaten by rats.
This is what I've got.
With half the records missing and the other half damaged by rodents, Detective Rubin has his work cut out for him.
They decided to pack them all up, and they shipped them to the ATF. I went back home with nothing. I was thinking that we'll never find those records.
Hello, this is Detective Rubin.
A week passes. Finally, on June 12, 2013, Detective Rubin gets a call from agents with the ATF.
The ATF called me and they were like, we found a receipt from this pawn shop and we're faxing you something right now.
You're kidding. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks.
He was on pins and needles. He's excited now. He's had a cold case for months.
Will this fax be the break Detective Rubin has been looking for? Or will it simply be another dead end?
I stood in front of the fax machine. I was just waiting and waiting and waiting, and the fax finally came through.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye.
After 12 painstaking months, Detective Dimitri Rubin of the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department is about to discover if his search for the owner of the gun used to murder Eric Samoa has paid off.
He had traced a handgun found near Eric's home to a pawn shop in Mississippi, and the ATF was faxing him a receipt about that gun purchase.
And as the fax was coming up, I saw Katrina Ben's name on the paperwork, and it was just like, finally, we got her.
Detective Rubin called me and said, Jessica, we got the gun. guess who it belongs to? And I said, Dimitri, just tell me. Like, I can't take it anymore.
It's hers.
Now, police have to find Katrina Ben.
We learned that Katrina Ben returned back to Mississippi, so we flew to Mississippi once again to arrest her. The local department arrested her, and she came in cool as a cucumber like she always was.
The news that Katrina Ben had been arrested for Eric's murder was a relief to his family, but it was also shocking because they had never met this woman in their life. It was just a mystery why someone Eric had been dating for just 2 weeks would murder him.
It's a question prosecutors know they'll have to answer if they hope to convict Katrina on first-degree murder charges. On October 15th, 2014, over 2 years after Eric Samoa's death, the case finally gets underway.
Motive was one of the hardest pieces for us.
How are you going to convince a jury that a woman who has Katrina Ben's background, absence of criminal history, professional, attractive young woman, why in the world would she be driven and be willing to do this?
In their opening arguments, prosecutors offer up their version of how the murder came to pass.
She was the kind of girl that had her uses, and it wasn't the girl you took out. She wasn't the girl that Eric showed off. She wasn't the girl that Eric was introducing to his family.
Miss Ben was someone who came into his life. They started a relationship. I don't think it really was of much consequence to him.
And according to prosecutors, Katrina thought she was more than just Eric's late-night booty call.
The defendant believed she landed Eric, this handsome, smart, charismatic, social, professional man. But what she didn't know is that Eric had a girlfriend, and Derek was dating other women too.
The way she discovered this is she got a hold of his phone, I think read some of his text messages, and realized very much towards the end of the 30 days that they knew each other that, God, my God, he's talking to all these other people. She was angry, felt betrayed.
Not something that normal human beings engage in homicide for, but for Katrina Ben, that threshold was just so low. And at some point, the disrespect she perceived was so great that she wasn't going to sit back and do nothing about it.
Prosecutors argue that on the night of June 4th, 2012, Katrina exacted her revenge.
We do believe that on that night, Katrina Ben had her gun with her, the gun that she purchased from Mississippi. We know they watched basketball. We know that they had sex. And then she waited for him to go to sleep, and she put a bullet into his skull.
One shot, point blank range into Eric's head. This was an execution.
After laying out their theory of what happened, prosecutors introduce a mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence to support it.
They had evidence that Katrina Ben did in fact own a .380 caliber handgun, and that she had in fact been in his apartment the night he was killed, and she was being deceptive in her statements to police.
But when it's time to present their case, the defense paints an entirely different picture of Katrina Ben.
Eric Samoa's death is awful and it's tragic. But Katrina Ben is not the right person. She did not kill Eric Samoa.
Their argument was that Katrina was neither jealous nor obsessive. She was in fact a very independent woman who was not looking for a long-term boyfriend.
Katrina's defense team also raises the possibility that their client wasn't the only woman with access to Eric's apartment.
Eric had multiple girlfriends, other people who could get into his apartment, and he was known, proven, to interact with at least one drug dealer.
On October 22nd, 2014, after a week of testimony, both sides rest their case. The jury needs just 6 hours to return with their verdict.
Katrina was convicted of first-degree murder with the use of a handgun in the commission of a felony. And her sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 20 years.
Though the verdict and sentence is a victory for Eric's family, their celebration is muted.
I think convictions in murder cases are rather hollow for the victims' families. They may be satisfied that the person's held responsible, but their days go on, and the person they loved is no longer with them.
Adding insult to the Samoa family's injury is the bizarre statement Katrina makes at her sentencing hearing.
Katrina Benn actually stood up and gave some sort of a attempt at eulogizing Eric, as if she really was far removed from why he was dead and why they were all in the courtroom that day.
While Katrina's self-serving statement is a bitter pill to swallow, it doesn't change the fact that she'll spend the rest of her life in prison.
She's gonna be in there for a long time, and she's gonna have to think about what she did and why.
I think he paid an ultimate price for whatever he created in her mind's eye about the nature of the relationship. That was simply not what he was involved in. She was in a much different relationship than him.
Cutting through the heavy, stagnant air. Sarah Graves was there too, followed by a live-streaming camera crew. She wanted to catch the hoax in real time. "Go ahead, Seffi," Sarah challenged. "Show the world your empty room." Sophie and Victor reached the far corner of the basement. The floor was made of old redwood planks, sea-worn and gray. Sophie knelt, feeling for a notch, a sign, anything. Suddenly, her fingers found a brass ring hidden beneath a layer of grime. She pulled. The floor didn't just open, it slid away, revealing a small, stone-lined chamber. Inside, there were no gold bars or stolen deeds. There were thousands of photographs. Larry Dalla had spent his entire life documenting the real Santa Monica. Not the glamorous celebrities, but the waitresses, the janitors, the poets, and the families who lived in the shadows of the palms. And next to the photos were hundreds of letters from Jack Tripper to the people he had helped, the meals he had cooked for free, the small, quiet acts of kindness that he had never mentioned to anyone. "It's not a vault of treasure," Sophie said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "It's a vault of witnesses. This is the truth, Sarah. My father and Larry didn't just share a lie. They shared a responsibility. They were the keepers of the neighborhood's heart." Even Sarah Graves was silent. The livestream reflected a reality that couldn't be debunked, a life built on a foundation of genuine human connection. Chapter 30. The Eternal Architecture. The heist story was forgotten, replaced by the archive of the boardwalk. The medical bills were paid through a foundation set up to preserve the photos. Larry Dallas recovered enough to see his work displayed in a gallery at the Santa Monica Museum of Art. Jack and Janet returned from their cruise to find their daughter a hero and their legacy more secure than ever. One evening, the whole group gathered on the balcony of apartment 201. The wicker table had returned for the night, and Jack was serving his famous, "Now, you know," Jack said, looking out at the boardwalk where a new generation was laughing and dancing. "I used to worry that the lie was the only thing people would remember, that we were just a punchline." "Jack," Janet said, taking his hand, "a lie is just a temporary roof. It kept us dry while we built the walls. But the walls are made of what we did for each other, and those walls are never coming down." Sophie stood next to Victor, watching the sunset. "What's next, architect?" she asked her father. Jack smiled, that same mischievous twinkle as bright as the day he first walked into the apartment. "I was thinking about the kitchen," Jack said. "It could use a little redecorating. I know a guy who's very good with threads." Mr. Furley, now a centenarian but still wearing a shocking shade of lavender, raised his glass. "Just as long as you don't touch the bathroom lights, Jack. I'm still not sure who left it on in 1978. The laughter that followed was the sound of a building that was finally, perfectly, eternally complete. The architecture was solid. The foundation was love. And in apartment 201, the door was always open. The kisses were always real, and company, well, company was the only thing that made the house a home. Chapter 31. The Flavor of Inheritance. The success of the Archive exhibition brought a new kind of pressure to Tripper's table. Sophie found herself constantly under the microscope of high-end food critics, who were looking for a flaw in her honest cuisine. One afternoon, while reorganizing the storage room in the flower shop Solera, space Janet had kept mostly for rare bulbs and antique gardening, tool Sophie found a heavy, rusted metal box. "What's this, Mom?" Sophie asked, dusting off the lid. Janet looked up from her ledger, a curious light in her eyes. I haven't seen that since we moved the big lilies back in '85. It belonged to Jack's mother, but he always said it was empty. They pried it open to find not an empty box, but a single, brittled envelope and a small glass vial containing a dried, dark crimson spice. The letter was addressed to Jack, written in a shaky but elegant hand. Jack, this is the salt of the earth, a secret our family carried from the old country. It's not just a spice, it's a memory. Use it only when the fire in your heart feels cold. Sophie felt a chill. The spice smelled of smoke, honey, and something ancient. She realized that while Jack had built his career on French techniques and Professor Beaumont's teachings, there was a whole world of his own heritage he had never tapped into, perhaps because he was too busy maintaining the facade. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "I think I know how to make the next menu. I'm going to cook the Tripper heritage." Chapter 32. The Corporate Shadow. While Sophie was experimenting with the ancient spice, a new storm was brewing on the horizon. A conglomerate known as Nexus Foods had begun buying up the remaining independent leases on the boardwalk. They were a faceless entity, represented by a group of young, aggressive lawyers who spoke in terms of optimization and synergy. "We're not here to destroy, Mr. Tripper," the lead lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, said as he sat in the restaurant. "We're here to elevate. We want to turn Tripper's Table into a global brand. 10 locations by next year. A line of frozen entrees. A reality TV show with Sophie as the judge." Jack leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You want to turn my heart into a microwavable box?" "We want to ensure it survives the next century," Thorne replied coldly. "The boardwalk is charming, but it's inefficient. We've already secured 60% of the voting rights in the local council. We can change the zoning laws with a single phone call." The threat was clear. If Jack didn't sell, Nexus would surround them with corporate chain restaurants, effectively choking out the authentic vibe that made Tripper's Table unique. Larry Dallas, who had been listening from the bar, snorted. "Synergy. I've got your synergy right here, Thorne. It's called Get Out of Our House." But Victor was worried. He knew the financial power of Nexus. "They don't just buy buildings, Sophie. They buy reputations. If we don't play along, they'll start a smear campaign that will make Sarah Graves look like a fangirl." Chapter 33. The Night of 1,000 Lilies. To fight back, Janet suggested a gala night of 1,000 lilies to celebrate the boardwalk's history and the unveiling of Sophie's new heritage menu. It was a gamble. If the critics didn't like the new direction, or if Nexus managed to sabotage the event, the Tripper legacy would be over. The night of the gala, the boardwalk was transformed. Janet had covered every surface in white lilies, their intoxicating scent mixing with the salt of the sea. Sophie was in the kitchen, her heart pounding. She had used the salt of the earth in every dish, creating flavors that felt like they were pulled from a dream. But as the first course was served, a group of protesters appeared outside the restaurant, carrying signs that read "Tripper's Table, built on lies," and "Ditch the It's Marcus Thorne," Victor hissed, watching from the window. He hired them to disrupt the service. Jack stood up, his silver hair catching the candlelight. He didn't call the police. He didn't shout. Instead, he walked out to the protesters carrying a tray of small, warm pastries Sophie had just made. "I know you're here to work," Jack said to the leader, a young man who looked more hungry than angry. "But even a worker needs to eat. Taste this. It's my family's history. If you still want to shout after you've eaten, I'll join you." One by one, the protesters took a pastry. The silence that followed was the most powerful thing Jack had ever seen. The flavor of the salt of the earth seemed to bypass their anger and reach something deeper, a shared humanity. By the time the main course was served inside, the protesters had laid down their signs and were sitting on the boardwalk, listening to the music. Chapter 34. The Deconstruction of Thorne. The gala was a triumph, but Marcus Thorne wasn't finished. He appeared at the end of the night, his face twisted in frustration. "You think a few pastries will stop us?" Thorne sneered. "We own the debt on your flower shop, Mrs. Tripper. We bought it from the bank this morning. If you don't sign the merger, we foreclose on Monday." Janet didn't flinch. She pulled a small, silver key from around her neck. "You bought the debt, Mr. Thorne, but you didn't check the bylaws of the bank. The Tripper family has had a perpetual trust since 1982 set up by Professor Beaumont himself. That trust covers any and all debt incurred by the flower shop or the restaurant in perpetuity. Your purchase is null and void." Thorne's face went pale. He hadn't counted on the architecture of Beaumont's foresight. The old man had built a legal sanctuary that was as solid as the arch Sophie had found in the blueprints. Larry Dallas stepped forward. His camera, flash blinding Thorn, smile for the headline. Nexus Foods. The Emperor has no clothes. Chapter 30. The sun set over Santa Monica one final time in the pages of their story. The boardwalk was secure. Nexus Foods had reached their lawyers defeated by a combination of legal foresight and the power of a single, ancient spice. Sophie and Victor were now the unofficial king and queen of the coast, their partnership having survived the fire of corporate war. Jack and Janet sat on their balcony, the same wicker table between them. They looked at the Pacific, their hands entwined. "We did it, architect," Janet whispered. "No," Jack replied, leaning his head on hers. "We didn't just do it. We lived it. Every meal, every laugh, every burnt. It was all part of the design." A soft knock came at the door. Uncle Jack, Aunt Janet. Sophie's voice was full of excitement. "You have to see this. A group of kids just moved into 301. They asked me if they needed a Brotherhood certificate to live there." Jack laughed, a sound that carried across the water, joining the ghosts of Furley, the Ropers, and the old man. "Tell them to come in," Jack called out. "We've been waiting for them." The architecture was finally complete. The lie was gone. The truth was eternal. And in apartment 201, the door was always open. Chapter 30. With the defeat of Nexus Foods, Sophie hoped for a period of calm to refine her heritage menu. However, the culinary world was never truly at rest. A former sous chef of Jack's, a man named Julian Varga, who had been fired years ago for attempting to sell Jack's recipes, resurfaced in the headlines. Julian had opened a rival restaurant in Beverly Hills called the Gilded Facade, and he was claiming that he was the true inheritor of the Salt of the Earth recipe. He alleged that Jack had stolen the vial from Julian's family during their time at the Culinary Institute. "It's a lie," Sophia Jack said, his hands trembling as he read the tabloid. "Julian's family didn't even come from the same region. My mother gave me that vial on her death." "He doesn't need it to be true, Dad," Sophie replied. "He just needs to plant the seed of doubt. The critics are already starting to ask questions." Sophie realized she had to do more than just cook. She had to prove the provenance of their heritage. She decided to track the lineage of the spice back to its source, a small, secluded village in the hills of Calabria, Italy. Chapter 37. The Ghost of Cindy Snow. Before they could depart for Italy, Janet found a bundle of old letters tucked into the back of a drawer in the apartment. They were from Cindy Snow, written in the years after she moved out. Cindy had written about the night she left, revealing a secret she had kept for decades. She hadn't moved out just to find her own architecture. She had moved out because she had realized that as long as she was there, the three would always be a barrier to the two that Jack and Janet needed to become. "I saw the way you looked at her, Jack," Cindy wrote, "and I saw the way she looked at you. You were both so busy protecting me that you were forgetting to protect each other. Moving out was the only way I could give you the space to be honest." Janet wept as she read the words. "She sacrificed her home so we could find ours," Janet whispered. "All those years we thought we were the ones helping her." The revelation added a new layer to the architect. It wasn't just built on lies and truths. It was built on silent sacrifices. It gave Sophie a new sense of purpose for their journey. They weren't just searching for a spice. They were honoring the people who had made their lives possible. Chapter 38. The International Stage. The journey to Paris for the Global Culinary Summit was meant to be Sophie's grand introduction to the world stage. Victor went as her photographer, capturing every moment for a new book they were planning. But Paris was a battlefield. High-end French chefs looked down on Sophie's coastal fusion, and Julian Varga was there, whispering in the ears of the judges. "You're out of your league, Sophie," Julian hissed as they passed in the hallway of the Grand Palais. "The world doesn't want truth. They want prestige, and I have the backing of the old money." Sophie's response was a dish that defied every French convention. She used the salt of the earth to create a bouillabaisse that tasted not of the Mediterranean, but of the Pacific sea salt, sun-drenched rosemary, and the smoke of a Santa Monica sunset. The critics were stunned. The salt of the earth didn't just add flavor, it added a sense of place. It was the only dish at the summit that felt like a confession. Mr. Tripper, the lead judge, a legendary Michelin-starred chef, said, "You have brought the ocean into this room. Not the ocean of the maps, but the ocean of the heart." Sophie had won the summit, But more importantly, she had reclaimed the narrative. Julian Varga was exposed when a French genealogist, hired by Victor, proved that Julian's claims were entirely fabricated. Chapter 3. Upon their return to Santa Monica, they found that Eleanor Prynne had not retreated into the shadows. Instead, she had shifted her tactics. She was no longer trying to buy the boardwalk. She was trying to rebrand it through social engineering. She had started a non-profit called the Horizon Collective, which was buying up the digital rights to the boardwalk's history. She wanted to create an AR tour that would overlay the real history with a sanitized, corporate version. She's trying to edit the memory of the place, Janet said, watching a digital demo on her tablet. In her version, the pen pals never existed. The Regal Beagle was always a high-end bistro. She's erasing the grit that made us real. Sophie and Victor realized they had to fight a digital war. They used the archive of the boardwalk to create their own AR experience, one that was free and open to everyone. It used Larry's photos to show the boardwalk as it truly was. Messy, vibrant, and built on the strength of its people. The community chose the real AR over the corporate one. Eleanor's Horizon Collective became a laughingstock, proving that you can't rebrand a heart that's still beating. Chapter 40. The Master Architect. The final chapter of the Tripper legacy took place on a warm June night. Sophie was standing in the kitchen of Tripper's table, watching her own team move with the same frantic, joyful energy that Jack once had. Jack and Janet were sitting at their favorite table, looking out at the boardwalk. They were no longer the master architects. They were the residents of the masterpiece. Sophie walked out and sat with them. "We're adding a new wing to the restaurant," she said, showing them a sketch. "It's going to be a culinary school for the neighborhood kids. No tuition, just a commitment to the truth." Jack smiled, the same mischievous twinkle as bright as the day he first walked into the apartment. "And the curriculum?" Jack asked. "First lesson," Sophie said, "check how the furniture looks on the sofa. Second lesson, never forget the salt of the earth." As the Santa Monica moon rose one last time, the architecture of a lie was finally, irrevocably transformed into the architecture of home. The lie was the scaffolding, the truth was the foundation, and the love, well, the love was the only thing that kept the roof from falling in. And in apartment 201, the door was always open, the kisses were always real, and company was the only thing that made the house a home. Chapter 41. The Calabria Connection. The plane touched down in La Mazia term, and Sophie felt the weight of history in the warm, humid air of Calabria. Victor, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, looked out at the rolling hills covered in olive groves and citrus trees. "We're a long way from the boardwalk, Sophie," he said, taking her hand. They traveled to Santo Nicola di Trippa, a village so small it barely appeared on a map. It was a place of stone houses clinging to cliffs, where the scent of wild oregano and sea spray was permanent. Sophie carried the vial of salt of the earth like a compass. At the village square, they met an elderly woman named Nonna Rosa. When Sophie showed her the vial, the old woman's eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak English, but she took Sophie's hand and led her to a small, hidden cave near the edge of the village. Inside the cave was a massive, ancient stone oven. The oven of the silent, Victor translated using a local guide. During the years of the Great Migrations and Wars, the families here didn't have much, but they had the salt from the sea and the smoke from the herbs. They created this spice to remind them that even if they left, the earth of their home would always be part of them. Sophie realized that the spice wasn't a secret recipe for flavor. It was a recipe for resilience. Her grandmother had carried it to America not to open a restaurant, but to ensure that even in a world built on lies, her children would always have a grain of truth to hold on to. Chapter 42. The Crisis of the Arch. While Sophie and Victor were discovering the bitter root in Italy, a literal tremor shook Santa Monica. A localized earthquake had caused a minor shift in the boardwalk's foundation. Janet called Sophie, her voice trembling. "Sophie, the building, the residential side above the restaurant. The city has issued a yellow tag. They say the arch, the one you found in the blueprints, has a hairline fracture." Sophie's heart plummeted. If the arch was compromised, Eleanor Prynne would have the legal grounds. She needed to declare the entire structure unsafe and push for total demolition. "We're coming home, Mom," Sophie said, already packing the vial. When they arrived, the boardwalk was a mess of yellow tape and sirens. Eleanor Prynne was already there, flanked by a team of structural engineers. "I told you the architecture was obsolete, Jack," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the hollow restaurant. It's not just a lie anymore. It's a liability. Jack stood his ground, though he looked older than Sophie had ever seen him. The building has stood for 100 years. Eleanor, it's not going down because of a little shiver. It's going down because the law says so, Eleanor countered. You have 48 hours to prove it can be repaired, or the wrecking ball arrives on Monday. Chapter 43. The Reunion of Three. The Tripper household was in a state of quiet desperation. They needed a miracle, or at least a level of expertise that went beyond modern engineering. A knock came on the door of apartment 201. Not a frantic knock, but a rhythmic, familiar one. Sophie opened the door. Standing there was a woman in a perfectly tailored white jumpsuit, her blonde hair still vibrant, her eyes full of a wisdom that only decades of living could bring. "Mom," Sophie whispered. Cindy Snows stepped into the apartment. She wasn't alone. Behind her was Mike, but more importantly, she was carrying a stack of old, weathered blueprints, the original hand-drawn plans by Arthur Prynne and Professor Bowman. "I heard the boardwalk was shaking," Cindy said, hugging Sophie, and then turning to Jack and Janet. "And I realized I still have the keys to the truth." That night, the original trio sat around the heavy oak table. They looked at the plans. They realized that the arch Sophie had found wasn't just made of stone and mortar. It was designed to be flexible. Arthur Prynne was an amateur geologist, Cindy explained, pointing to a notation in the corner of the map. He knew this coast would move. The arch is built with a hinge point hidden behind the kitchen pantry. It's supposed to shift. The fracture isn't a failure. It's the building breathing. Chapter 44. The Final Stand. Monday morning arrived with the sound of heavy machinery. A crowd had gathered, but the atmosphere was different. The neighborhood wasn't just watching. They were standing on the boardwalk, a human wall in front of Tripper's table. Sophie, Jack, Janet, and Cindy walked out to meet Eleanor Prynne. "The demolition starts now," Eleanor said, signaling to the crane operator. "Stop!" Sophie shouted, stepping forward with the original blueprints and a live feed from a camera she had inserted into the hinge point Cindy had identified. She showed the city council and the engineers that the fracture was actually an expansion joint that had functioned exactly as Arthur Prynne intended. The building was more secure than the modern luxury malls Eleanor wanted to build. "Your father didn't just build a building," Eleanor Jock said, his voice regaining its strength. "He built a promise, and that promise still holds." The city council president, who had been a regular at the Regal Beagle in his youth, looked at the data and then at the three friends who had defined the boardwalk for generations. "Order rescinded," he announced. "The architecture is sound." The crowd erupted in a cheer that could be heard all the way to the pier. Eleanor Prynne turned and walked away, her glass horizon finally shattered by the strength of a century-old arch. Chapter 45. The Architecture of Eternity. The celebration lasted 4 days. The culinary school opened its doors that September, with Sophie as the head instructor and Jack as the professor emeritus of soul. Cindy stayed in Santa Monica, moving into a small apartment just down the hall from two. The three were together again, their laughter echoing in the hallways, just as it had in the 70s, though the topics of conversation had shifted from bad dates to the legacy of their grandchildren. One evening, Sophie and Victor sat on the balcony of the restaurant. They had finished their book, The Architecture of Truth, and the first copy sat on the table between them. "What now, Sophie?" Victor asked. Sophie looked at the vial of salt of the earth, which now sat in a glass display case in the center of the dining room. "Now," Sophie said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "we just live the truth. We build our own wing. We make sure the door is always open." As the Santa Monica moon rose, casting a silver path across the water, the architecture of a lie was no longer a story of deception. It was the architecture of eternity, a home built on the only foundation that truly lasts, the people who knock on the door, and the love that makes them stay. And in apartment 201, the lights were on, the table was set, and company was the only thing that mattered in the end. Chapter 46. The Order of the Silver Spatula. The worldwide success of the Architecture of Truth was a double-edged sword. While it brought pilgrims to the boardwalk, it also caught the eye of a shadow organization known as the Order of the Silver Spatula. This group, a cabal of the world's most powerful and secretive gourmets, had spent centuries collecting lost flavors and culinary relics. One evening, a man with a silver cane and a monotone voice entered Tripper's table. He didn't order from the menu. He simply pointed to the display case, holding the salt of the earth. "That vial doesn't belong in a glass box, Sophie Tripper," the man said. It belongs to history, and history is a very demanding landlord. The man, who introduced himself as Count Valier, claimed that the spice was part of a larger set of elemental salts, used by Renaissance kings to keep their kingdoms in balance. He offered Sophie a blank check for the vial. My family's resilience isn't for sale, Count, Sophie replied firmly. Valerius smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. The architecture of truth is a beautiful concept, but you forget one thing. The truth can be stolen as easily as a lie. Chapter 4. The threat wasn't empty. 2 nights later, the silent alarms in the restaurant were triggered. Sophie, who was staying in the apartment above with Victor, rushed down with a heavy rolling pin. They found the display case shattered, but the vial was gone. The intruder hadn't used a lockpick or a glass cutter. They had used a high-powered sonic device that had turned the reinforced glass into dust. They're professionals, Victor Suvi whispered, looking at the empty pedestal. But Victor noticed something. On the floor, among the glass shards, was a single, small silver bead, the head of Count Valerius's cane. He didn't just take the spice, Victor realized. He left a calling card. He wants us to follow him. The quest led them to a hidden estate in the hills above Mount, a fortress of steel and glass that stood in stark contrast to the wooden warmth of the boardwalk. This was the glass horizon that Eleanor Prynne had dreamed of, but far more sinister. Chapter 43. The Ghost of the Regal Beagle. While Sophie and Victor were chasing the Count, Jack and Janet decided to do some investigating of their own. They returned to the basement of the Regal Beagle, convinced that Arthur Prynne had hidden more than just photographs. They spent hours tapping on the stone walls until Jack found a loose brick. Behind it was a small, lead-lined box containing a set of letters from the 19th. Janet, look, Jack said, his voice hushed. These are from my grandfather to Arthur Prynne's father. They were partners. They didn't just build the boardwalk. They were protectors of the salt of the earth. The letters revealed that the spice wasn't just a memory. It was a catalyst. When used by someone with a pure heart, it could heal the spirit of a community. But in the hands of the selfish, it was just salt. The Order of the Silver Spatula wants it because they think it's a spice for kings, Janet realized. But it only works for roommates. This was the final piece of the architecture. The building stood not because of the arch or the hinge, but because the spirit of the people was literally seasoned by the truth. Chapter 49. To get the vial back, Sophie and Victor realized they couldn't just use force. They had to go back to the Source Calabria to find the counter-spice. They returned to Santo Nicola di Trupa, but this time they were pursued by the Order's drones. Nonna Rosa met them again, her eyes knowing. You seek the bitter root, she said through the translator. The salt brings the balance, but the root brings the clarity. One cannot exist without the other. She led them deeper into the cave, to a spot where the salt-heavy air met an underground spring. There, growing in the dark, were translucent, pale roots that smelled of ozone and earth. Take the root, Sophie, Nonna Rosa commanded. When the Count uses the salt to feed his ego, the root will show him the architecture of his own lies. The journey back was a race against time. The Order was planning a feast of the century in Paris, where they would use the salt of the earth to manipulate the world's most powerful leaders into signing a treaty that would give the Order control over the world's food supply. Chapter 50. The Final Revelation. The Paris Opera House was filled with the elite. Sophie and Victor, disguised as catering staff, watched as Count Valerius prepared the main course. He held the vial over a massive silver tureen, his face glowing with a dark triumph. As he sprinkled the dark crimson grains into the soup, Sophie stepped forward. Wait, she shouted. The Count laughed. Too late, Sophie. The world is about to taste the truth of kings. No, Sophie said, pulling the bitter root from her pocket and dropping it into the tureen. They're about to taste the truth of the people. The reaction was instantaneous. The soup didn't turn into a magical elixir. It turned into a mirror. Every person who took a sip didn't feel like a king. They felt the weight of their own decisions. The politicians saw their broken promises. The CEOs saw their exploited workers. The room was filled not with power, but with a profound, collective shame. Count Valerius, who had tasted the soup first, collapsed. He saw the glass horizon of his ego crumbling into the sea. The architecture, he gasped. It's not glass. It's wood. Sophie and Victor walked out of the opera house, the vial back in their hands. They didn't return it to the display case. They took it back to apartment 201, where Jack, Jeanette, and Cindy were waiting with a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup. Sophie opened the vial and sprinkled a single grain into each of their bowls. "What is it, Sophie?" Jack asked. "It's just salt, Dad," she said, smiling. "But it's our salt." As they sat together, the five of them, the boardwalk outside was quiet. The waves, a gentle pulse against the sand. The architecture of a lie was a ghost of the past. The architecture of truth was a monument for the future. But the architecture of home, that was just a table, some soup, and the people who would always be there when you knocked on the door. Chapter 51. Dissonance in the Hall of Mirrors. The morning after the Paris revelation, the world was a different place. The mirror soup had not only exposed the elites, but it also created a massive, global thirst for authenticity. Sophie Tripper, the woman who had dropped the bitter root, was no longer just a chef. She was a symbol. Back in Santa Monica, a sea of cameras and reporters had anchored themselves in front of Tripper's table. They weren't looking for a recipe. They were looking for a confession. "Everyone wants to be a roommate now," Jack sighed, watching the crowds from the balcony of apartment 201. "They think if they eat our food, their lies will disappear." Sophie sat at the table, her head in her hands. The weight of being the world's truth-teller was exhausting. Victor was constantly busy, not with photography, but with managing legal threats from the remaining members of the Order of the Silver Spatula, who were rebranding themselves as a philosophical institute to avoid prosecution. "We need to go back to the blueprint, Sophie," Victor said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The architecture isn't about the world. It's about this building." Chapter 52. The Foundation of Sophie and Victor. In the midst of the global chaos, Sophie and Victor decided it was time to build their own foundation. They announced their engagement, but not with a celebrity gala. They chose to have the ceremony in the basement of the Regal Beagle, among the thousands of photographs Larry Dallas had taken. The preparation for the wedding became a neighborhood project. Janet designed the Lilies of Clarity, while Cindy organized a truth dance class at her gyms to raise money for the Boardwalk's new youth program. But as the date approached, a mysterious letter arrived at apartment 201. It wasn't signed by a count or a corporate lawyer. It was written in a familiar, shaky hand on a piece of stationery from a long-defunct hotel in Loyola. "The turtle is still hungry, Jack, and the light is still on. Meet me where the building first sank." Jack's face went pale. "It can't be." Chapter 53. The Return to the Sinking Floor. The letter led Jack, Janet, and Cindy down to the storage rooms beneath the apartment complex. There, in the dim light, sat a figure in an impeccably preserved, albeit dusty, tangerine leisure suit. "Mr. Furley," Jeanette whispered. The figure turned. It wasn't Ralph Furley, but his younger brother, Bart Furley, whom they had briefly met decades ago. He was holding a small, silver key, the twin to the one Jack had used to secure the bowman. "Ralph always told me this building had a secret floor," Bart said, his voice rasping. "He said the architecture of a lie was only half the story. There's a basement beneath the basement, a place where the original architect, Arthur Prain's father, kept the real records of the land." They followed Bart to a hidden elevator behind a stack of old mattresses. As they descended, the air grew cool and smelled of ancient cedar. The elevator opened into a room filled with blueprints that weren't for Santa Monica, but for a city that never was. A city built entirely on the principles of the salt of the earth, where every home was connected by shared kitchens and no one lived alone. Chapter 54. The Architect's Dream. Sophie and Victor joined them in the hidden city. They realized that the architecture of a lie isn't just a clever name for their history. It was a defensive maneuver. Arthur Prynne had hidden the plans for this honest city, because the world wasn't ready for it. He wasn't protecting a spice, Sophie realized, tracing the lines of a communal garden. He was protecting a way of life. The lies, Jack told Furley. They were the only way to keep this place from being turned into a factory or a mall a century ago. The revelation shifted everything. Sophie didn't want to just be a chef anymore. She wanted to be the architect of this new world. She and Victor decided to turn the Tripper's Table Culinary School into a global network. They would teach not just cooking, but the architecture of connection. They would show people how to build apartment 201s in their own city's places, where the door is always open, even if the rent is a little high and the roommates are a little crazy. Chapter 55. The Eternal Knock. The wedding of Sophie Tripper and Victor Dallas was a symphony of history and future. Sophie wore a dress woven with silk from Calabria, and Victor carried his father's first camera. The ceremony ended not with a kiss, but with a knock. The entire neighborhood stood outside the Regal Beagle and knocked on the door in unison, a thunderous sound that echoed across the Pacific. It was the sound of a community claiming its truth. Jack and Janet sat on the balcony of 201 later that night. Sophie and Victor had already departed for their trek through the hills of Calabria to find more bitter root for the world. "Do you think it will last, Jack?" Janet asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Jack looked at the apartment behind them. The furniture was a mix of 70s wicker and modern oak. The kitchen was clean. The light in the bathroom was... "The building might sink one day, Janet," Jack said softly. "The ocean might come for the boardwalk. But as long as someone is waiting for that knock, the architecture is solid." A soft sound came from the hallway. A new tenant, a young man who looked as confused and earnest as Jack had been in 1977, was standing at the door. "Excuse me," the young man said. "I'm looking for apartment 201. I heard this was a place where you never have to be alone." Jack smiled, the same mischievous twinkle as bright as ever. He stood up and walked to the door. "Come on in," Jack said, stepping back and holding the door wide. "We've been waiting for you." As the Santa Monica moon rose, the golden facade of the building glowed with a light that didn't come from the sun. It was the light of the truth. Finally, perfectly, at home. Chapter 50. The dust of Calabria was a different kind of earth. For Sophie and Victor, their trek through the rugged hills of Nona Rosa's village was less of a vacation and more of a pilgrimage. They spent their days digging for the bitter root and their nights translating the journals they had found in the hidden, honest city beneath's apartment 201. "Victor, look at this entry from 1922, Sophie said, pointing to a faded ink sketch in Arthur Prain's father's hand. "He mentions the silent oven of Calabria. He says the architecture of the building was literally modeled after the way the heat flows in those ancient stone caves. He wasn't just building an apartment. He was building a thermal battery of human warmth." The discovery was interrupted by the appearance of a local carabiniera, young officer named Marco, who had been watching them from a distance. He didn't approach them with a ticket, but with a question. "You are the ones from the news?" Marco asked in broken English. "The ones who make the soup that sees through the face?" Sophie nodded tentatively. Marco sighed and pulled a small, silver locket from his pocket. "In this village, we have many secrets, but since your soup, the people, they talk. My grandfather, he says the salt of the earth was never meant to be a spice. It was a catalyst for a type of clay, a clay that can never be broken." Sophie and Victor realized that the Order of the Silver Spatula had been looking for a flavor, but the real power was structural. The architecture of a lie was a physical reality. Chapter 57. The Apprentice of Apartment 201. Back in Santa Monica, the young man who had knocked on the door was quickly becoming a fixture in apartment 2. He was a student of architecture, coincidence that Jack found both suspicious and poetic. "So, Leo," Jack said one morning, watching the boy struggle with a vintage percolator. "Why here? Why this building? There are plenty of modern condos with actual elevators and floors that don't lean." Leo looked up, his eyes bright with a familiar kind of desperation. "Mr. Tripper, I've spent my whole life studying glass boxes, but this building, it has a soul ratio that defies the standard formula. I read about the architecture of a lie, and I realized that I didn't want to build houses. I wanted to build sanctuaries." Jack felt a tug at his heart. He saw himself in Leonard, the chef, but the man who was just looking for a place where he didn't have to pretend to be someone else to fit in. "Well, Lea," Jack said, handing him the coffee. "Sanctuaries are expensive. They cost you your pride, your secrets, and occasionally, your ability to tell a straight story to a landlord. But the coffee is free." Janet watched from the doorway, smiling. "He's going to be a handful, isn't he, Jack?" "The best kind of handful, Janet. The kind that needs a little salt." Chapter 58. The Algorithmic Shadow. While Sophie was digging in Italy and Leo was learning in Santa Monica, a new threat was coalescing in Northern California. A tech billionaire named Silas Vayner, direct descendant of Sebastian Vayner, had launched a new project called Vayner's goal was to monetize the global thirst for truth. He wanted to use advanced biometrics and social data to create a trust score for every human being on the planet. He marketed it as the digital version of the mirror soup, but without the empathy or the humanity. "The Trippers were pioneers," Silas Vayner said during a televised keynote. "But their truth is messy. It's emotional. It's inefficient. VERITAS.ai will provide a truth that is objective, calculated, and perfectly architected for the digital age. Vaughn had already begun aggressively acquiring the patents. Arthur Prynne had left behind patents that Prynne had thought were buried forever. He wanted to turn the honest city plans into a blueprint for a series of Veritas villages, gated communities, where your access to food and shelter was tied to your digital honesty. "He's turning our home into a prison," Sophie said over a crackling satellite phone from Calabria. "We need to get back, Victor," she said. "The bitter root isn't just for soup anymore. We need to season the network." Chapter 59. The Digital Siege. The confrontation happened not on the boardwalk, but in the virtual space where Silas Vaughn felt most secure. Vaughn had organized a grand unveiling of the first Veritas village, and he had invited the Tripper family as guests of honor, a classic move to co-opt their legacy. But Sophie and Victor didn't come alone. They brought Leo, who had spent weeks mapping the vulnerabilities in the Honor City blueprints that Vaughn was using. And they brought Jack and Janet, who provided the one thing Vaughn could never compute: a shared history. During the livestream, as Vaughn demonstrated how his algorithm could detect a lie in milliseconds, Sophie stepped onto the stage. "Your algorithm detects the lie, Silas," Sophie said, her voice steady. "But it doesn't understand the reason. My father lied to his landlord to keep a roof over his head and his friends together. That lie built a family. Your truth. It only builds a spreadsheet." Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, glass vial. It wasn't the salt. It was a concentrated extract of the bitter root. She didn't drop it into a soup. She dropped a single drop onto the biometric scanner on the podium. The reaction was a digital version of the Paris Opera House. The bitter root extract acted as a harmonic disruptor to Vaughn's senses. The algorithm didn't crash. It began to show the truth of Silas Vaughn himself. The screens behind him began to flicker with Vaughn's own trust score, a deep, flashing red. The world saw the architecture of Vaughn's own deceptions, the stolen patents, the manipulated data, the cold, hollow core of his digital empire. The crowd went silent. Vaughn stared at the screens, his golden facade crumbling in real time. "The architecture of a lie can protect people," Leo shouted from the back, "but the architecture of a scam only protects the scanner." Chapter 60. The Living Foundation. A year after the fall of Silas Vaughn, the boardwalk was quiet again. The hype of Veritas had faded, replaced by a more quiet, local movement. Sophie and Victor had officially opened the Printripper Institute of Architecture and Connection. Leo was their first graduate, and he was currently supervising the renovation of the Regal Beagle, turning it into a community center that maintained the old bar feel, but with a shared library and a professional kitchen. Jack and Janet had officially retired, meaning they spent 8 hours a day at the restaurant and the other 16 worrying about the students. Cindy was now the head of the resilience department, teaching the community how to bounce through the inevitable tremors of life. One evening, the whole group gathered on the balcony of apartment 200. They were celebrating the completion of the first honest wing, a small extension of the building that used the clay of Calabria to ensure the walls were as flexible as the hearts within them. Jack stood up, his silver hair catching the last rays of the sun. "You know," Jack said, looking at Sophie, Victor, Leo, and his old friends, "I spent most of my life trying to keep people out of this apartment so they wouldn't see the truth. But now, I realized the truth was never the problem. It was the fear that the truth wasn't enough." He raised his glass. "To the roommates, the ones we had, the ones we have, and the ones who haven't knocked yet." As the Santa Monica moon rose, the building didn't glow. It didn't flash. It just stood there, solid, slightly crooked, and perfectly at home. The architecture of a lie was complete. The architecture of truth was evolving. But the architecture of love? That was a structure that required no blueprints, only the willingness to answer when someone knocks on the door. The Nth Cowboy of Apartment 201. A novel of romance, deception, and shag carpeting. Prologue. The golden hour of Santa Monica. The Pacific Ocean was a bruised purple, reflecting a sun that refused to go down without a fight. In Santa Monica, the air smelled of salt, coconut-scented tanning oil, and the distant, greasy promise of burgers from the pier. It was 1979, an era defined by disco beats and the precarious balancing act of 3 young people sharing a 2-bedroom apartment. Apartment 201 was more than just a living space. It was a sanctuary of pastel colors and wicker furniture. But tonight, the air inside was thick with more than just the humidity of a California evening. It was thick with Jack Tripper's frustration. Chapter 1. The Tongue-Tied Chef. Jack Tripper sat at the kitchen table, a dog-eared Spanish textbook spread before him like a battle map. He was a man of many talents. He could julienne a carrot in seconds, and bake a that didn't collapse under the weight of a heavy cynut. Linguistics was his Achilles heel. "Mi lamo, Jack," he muttered, his voice a low rasp. "Dinner will be served at 8. La cena será a las 8. He was dreaming of a cruise ship. A friend had landed a gig cooking in the Caribbean, simply because he could navigate a menu in Spanish. For Jack, stuck in the grind of culinary school and part-time shifts, the idea of the open sea in a kitchen that smelled of lime and cilantro was intoxicating. "Jack, are you still at it?" He looked up. Janet Wood stood in the doorway, her hair perfectly coiffed in that sensible yet stylish bob that always seemed to catch the light. Janet was the anchor of the trio of florists with a heart of gold and a temper that only flared when the rent was late. "Mucha lousy, Janet," Jack sighed, dropping his head onto the book. "I'm trying to tell someone to bring me a bottle of red wine, and it sounds like I'm asking him for a glass of goat's blood." "Why the sudden rush to be bilingual?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "Opportunities, Janet. The world is bigger than Santa Monica. I found out about this cruise ship job. If I can just master the basics, I'm gone. Sailing into the sunset with a whisk in my hand." Janet felt a strange, sharp pang in her chest. The idea of Jack leaving of the apartment without his clumsy charm and the smell of his experimental sauces felt wrong. "You'd leave us for a boat?" "It's a big boat," Jack joked, though his eyes lingered on hers a second too long. Their moment was broken by the sound of the front door swinging open. Cindy Snow entered with her usual chaotic energy. Cindy was a secretary with the grace of a newborn giraffe. She didn't just walk into a room. She collided with it. "¿Dónde está el museo?" Cindy chirped, dropping her purse. Jack blinked. "The museum? Why are you asking about the museum?" "I heard you studying." Cindy laughed. "I thought I'd help. But honestly, Jack, I wouldn't take my clothes off there either." "What?" Jack asked, confused. "I don't know. It just sounded like a scandal." Before Jack could defend his honor, a sharp, rhythmic pounding echoed at the door. It wasn't the friendly knock of a neighbor. It was the frantic, neurotic beat of a man in crisis. Chapter 2. The Landlord's Paranoia. Ralph Furley was a man who dressed like a kaleidoscope had exploded in a polyester factory. Tonight, he was wearing a leisure suit, the color of a bruised plum, topped with an ascot that defied the laws of fashion. Jack, you gotta help me," Furley burst in, his eyes darting around as if the walls had ears. "Mr. Furley, calm down," Jeanette said, stepping forward. "What's wrong?" "My brother Bart. He's a serpent, I tell you. A cold-blooded reptile in a three-piece suit." Furley paced the shag carpet. "He's planted a spy in the building. He wants to find a reason to fire me, to take over the management." Jack stood up, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Furley, you're being paranoid again. Who's the spy?" "My niece, Veronica. She's staying the weekend while Bart's out of town. She's here to snoop, to document my every move, to report back that I'm in." "She's your niece," Cindy pointed out gently. "Maybe she just wanted to visit her favorite uncle." "Unlikely," Furley hissed. "Bart's tapped my phone before. He opened my mail. He even had a detective follow me to the bowling alley." Jack sighed. "Okay, so what do you want from us?" Furley stopped pacing and looked Jack up and down. His expression shifted from panic to a sort of desperate appraisal. "I need a distraction. I need a young man to take her out, to keep her busy so she can't watch me. Someone popular, good-looking, fun, a real man's man." Jack straightened his posture, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Mr. Furley, I like football. I drink beer. I'm not half bad at bowling." Furley let out a short, barking laugh. "Jack, I don't mean you. I mean a guy who likes women." The room went silent. The joke was an old wonder central lie that allowed Jack to live with two women in a conservative building was that he was gay. It was a ruse they all maintained for the sake of the lease. But tonight, the insult stung. Jack felt a flicker of genuine irritation. "Mr. Furley," Jack said, his voice dropping an octave, "there are a lot of different kinds of men in the world. And you aren't any of them." Jackie Boy Furley patted his cheek condescendingly. "Now, stay out of the way. I need to find a real stallion for Veronica." As Furley exited, Jack turned to the girls, His face flushed. A stallion. He thinks I'm a twerp. He thinks I'm a little nothing. He has to think that. Jack, Janet reminded him. Otherwise, we're out on the street. I know, Jack muttered, but a plan was already forming in his mindard dangerous, hilarious, utterly Tripper-esque plan. Chapter 3. The Birth of Austin. You're going to do what? Janet asked, her eyes wide. Jack was currently rummaging through the hall closets, throwing coats and umbrellas aside. He wants a stallion. I'll give him a stallion. I'll give him a whole herd of them. He pulled out an old, battered Stetson hat that Cindy had used for a Halloween costume years ago. He jammed it onto his head. Jack, you can't be serious, Cindy giggled. You're going to pretend to be your own brother. Not just a brother. My twin. My identical twin brother, Austin. From Texas, Jack said, adopting a thick, honey-slow drawl. I'm a cowboy, ladies. I wrestle steers. I drink my whiskey neat. And I don't take no sass from no one. Janet crossed her arm. Mr. Furley will see through you in 2 seconds. He sees what he wants to see, Jack argued. To him, Jack Tripper is a harmless, fluffy kitten. But Austin is a wolf. He stepped into the bathroom and emerged a moment later with a dark smudge on his cheek. And the only way you can tell us apart is this mole. That's eyeliner, Jack Janet dead. In the dim light of a lounge, it's a mole. Now, Cindy, go tell Mr. Furley that Jack's brother is in town. Tell him Austin is looking for a little company. Chapter 4. The Cowboy Rides In. The transformation was startling. When Jack emerged from the bedroom an hour later, he wasn't Jack anymore. He wore a denim shirt, unbuttoned just enough to be suggestive, the cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, and a swagger that seemed to take up the entire room. Well, boy howdy, he drawled, leaning against the door frame as Mr. Furley entered with a young woman in tow. Veronica was stunning tall, blonde, and possessing a sharp, observant gaze that made Jack's stomach do a nervous flip. This is him, Furley asked, his voice full of awe, Jack's twin. Austin Tripper, Jack said, stepping forward and taking Veronica's hand. He didn't just shake it, he kissed the back of it, his eyes locked onto hers with a predatory intensity that Jack Tripper wouldn't have dared. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. My eyes must be bugging out like a stomped and toed frog, 'cause you are the prettiest thing I've seen since the blue bonnets bloomed in Austin. Furley beamed. You see, Veronica, a real man, a Texan. Veronica smiled, a slow, playful curve of the lips. A cowboy in Santa Monica. How exotic. We're closer than 2 ticks on a dog's tail. Me and my brother Jack, Jack continued, ignoring Janet's muffled snort from the kitchen. Though he's a bit of a twerp, if I'm being honest. A real cream. Oh, I don't know, Veronica said, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. But a cowboy? That's a new frontier. The night began as a game, but as Jack Austin led Veronica to the sofa, the stakes began to change. He found himself telling stories of imaginary ranches and long nights under the stars. He found himself looking at Veronica and seeing not a spy, but a woman who looked bored of her father's games. And from the kitchen, Janet would watch them. She watched the way Jack leaned in, the way he laughed that deep, fake Texan laugh, and she realized with a jolt of jealousy that she liked the wolf much more than she should. Chapter 5. The Fog and the Fire. The evening took a turn for the chaotic when a thick, Pacific fog rolled in, blanketing the city in a white, impenetrable shroud. Airports closed, Furley announced, returning from a quick trip to his own apartment with a bottle of bourbon. Austin, you aren't going anywhere tonight. Looks like we've got ourselves a party. The tiny apartment felt smaller by the minute. Jack was trapped. He had to be Austin for Furley and Veronica, but he had to be Jack for the phone call he was expecting regarding the restaurant job. He spent the next 2 hours in a frantic blur. He would go to the kitchen as Austin, wash off the mole, discard the hat, and emerge as Jack to answer the phone or talk to Janet. Then, he would reverse the process, re-smudging the mole and reclaiming the drawl. Where's Jack? Furley asked, leaning back on the sofa, 3 drinks in. He's, studying, Cindy shouted from the kitchen, Spanish, very intense. Let's have a toast, Furley insisted. To friendship. To the Tripper brothers. Austin, get your brother out here. Jack felt a cold sweat break out. Oh, he's in the little Wrangler's room, Mr. Furley. Got a bit of a touch of the stomach flu. You know how it is. Nonsense. A drink will cure him. The pressure was mounting. Janet tried to intervene, dancing with Furley to distract him, but the landlord was determined. He wanted to see the two brothers together. In a moment of desperation, Jack ducked into the bedroom and grabbed a pillow, stuffing it into a spare set of clothes and propping it up in the shadows of the hallway. "There he is," Jack shouted, pointing to the dark silhouette. "He's just resting his eyes. Poor fella." But Veronica wasn't looking at the silhouette. She was looking at Jack. She had seen him wipe the mole off his face earlier. She had seen the hat hidden behind the sofa. She leaned in close to his ear, her breath warm against his neck. "You know, Jack, or Austin, whoever you are." Jack froze. "I think you're a much better actor than you are a cowboy," she whispered. "But the effort, that's what's really romantic." Before Jack could respond, Furley let out a celebratory yell. "I love this family. I love the Trippers." He grabbed Austin and Jack for a group hug, stumbling in his drunken haze. Chapter 6. The morning after. The fog cleared by dawn, leaving the apartment smelling of stale bourbon and deception. Veronica had left a note on the coffee table. "Uncle Ralph is convinced. My father will be happy. And I'll keep your secret, cowboy." Jack sat on the floor, the Stetson hat in his lap. He felt exhausted, his face sore from the fake drawl and the constant scrubbing of eyeliner. Janet walked out of her room, her hair messy, a cup of coffee in her hand. She sat down next to him. "So," she said quietly, "is Austin gone?" "Back to Texas." Jack sighed. He was a lot of work. "He was a bit of a jerk," Janet said, though she smiled. "But he was brave." Jack looked at her. "I think Jack Tripper is brave enough," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "He doesn't need a hat or a mole to be a stallion." Jack smiled, the first real smile of the night. He reached out and took her hand. For a moment, the cruise ship, the Spanish lessons, and the crazy landlords faded away. There was just the two of them, the quiet of the morning, and the realization that sometimes the best role to play was yourself. Outside, the Santa Monica sun began to rise again, bright and unapologetic, ready for another day of comedy, kisses, and the beautiful, messy business of being alive. Chapter 7. The Ghost of Austin. The days following the great cowboy deception were quiet, but the air in apartment 201 remained charged. Every time Jack caught Janet's eye, he saw a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, a softness that wasn't there before. Or perhaps a curiosity about the man who could summon a Texas rancher out of thin air. But life in Santa Monica didn't wait for romantic appeal. Jack's Spanish textbook was back on the table, though now it was stained with tomato sauce. The cruise ship job wasn't just a dream anymore. He had an interview at La Casa del Sol, a high-end Spanish restaurant where the owner was a consultant for the cruise line. "Tregam, una, botella de vino tinto," Jack practiced, his voice lackluster. "You sound like you're ordering an execution, Jack," Cindy said, pirouetting through the living room with a stack of files. "Lighten up, be more." Jack winced. "Austin is retired, Cindy. He's back in the panhandle, hopefully being eaten by a coyote." "I don't know," Janet said, entering from the balcony with a basket of wilting ferns. Austin had a certain charm. He knew what he wanted. He wasn't afraid to kiss a lady's hand. Jack looked at her sharply. "Is that what you want, Janet? A guy in a hat who kisses hands and talks about toad frogs?" Janet set the basket down and wiped her hands on her apron. "Maybe I just want a guy who isn't always apologizing for being himself." The phone rang, cutting through the tension. Jack lunged for it. "Hello. Yes, this is Jack Tripper. Tomorrow, at noon. Absolute, unsurpassed, sir. My cooking is unsurpassed. Yes, thank you." He hung up, his face pale. "The interview is tomorrow. If I get this, I'm one step closer to that ship." Janet's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's wonderful, Jack. Really, we should celebrate tonight." "The Regal Beagle," Cindy suggested. "The Regal Beagle," Janet agreed, though her voice sounded far away. Chapter 8. Neon Lights and Liquid Courage. The Regal Beagle was a local institutional dim, wood-paneled pub where the smell of spilled beer was part of the decor, and the jukebox played ABBA on a loop. It was the kind of place where you could lose an afternoon or find a bad idea. Larry Dallas was already there, perched at the bar in a silk shirt unbuttoned to his navel. Larry was Jack's best friend. A used car salesman with the morals of a hungry shark and a heart that was occasionally in the right place. Tripper, the man, the myth, the cowboy. Larry roared, slapping Jack on the back. Furley told me everything. He thinks you've got a twin who could wrestle a grizzly. Why didn't you tell me you were holding out on the talent, pal? It was a one-time thing, Larry, Jack muttered, sliding into a booth next to Jeanette and Cindy. One time, Jack, that Austin guy is a gold mine. You could use him to pick up flight attendants at the airport. Howdy, ma'am. I'm lost in this big OL city. Could you show me the way to your heart? Larry laughed, winking at a passing waitress. Janet sat stiffly, her hand wrapped around a glass of white wine. She felt out of place. Usually, she loved these nights out, the laughter and the familiar rhythm of their friendship. But tonight, she kept thinking about the way Jack had held Veronica on the sofa. She kept thinking about the fact that Jack was planning to leave. You're quiet, Jan, Jack said, leaning in. His shoulder brushed against hers, and for a second, the noise of the pub faded. Just tired, she lied. Busy day at the shop. Everyone wants lilies this week. Lilies represent rebirth, Jack said softly. Maybe that's what we all need. Before she could respond, a tall, well-dressed man approached their table. He looked like he belonged in a country club, not a pub. His eyes were fixed on Janet. Excuse me, the stranger said, his voice smooth and cultivated. I couldn't help but notice your arrangement of the ferns on your balcony this morning. I live in the building across the street. I'm David Vance. Janet blinked, surprised. The ferns, they're dying, Mr. Vance. Nonsense. They're struggling, and there's a great beauty in the struggle. You have a florist's touch, Miss Wood. Janet Wood. David Vance smiled, ignoring the rest of the table as if they were part of the furniture. Miss Wood, I would be honored if you would allow me to take you to dinner sometime. Somewhere with a bit more ambiance than this. Jack felt a sudden, hot surge of protectiveness. He stood up, almost knocking over his beer. She's busy, pal. We're in the middle of a celebration. David Vance looked at Jack with a mild, bored curiosity. And you are the younger brother. I'm the roommate, Jack snapped. And I'm the chef, so I know a lot about ambiance. And this place has plenty. David didn't lose his smile. He handed a small, embossed card to Janet. Think about it, Janet. A woman like you shouldn't spend all her nights in a place that smells of old floor wax. As David walked away, the table was silent. Larry whistled. Man, that guy has money written all over him. Janet, you're moving up in the world. Janet looked at the card, then at Jack. Jack's jaw was set, his eyes dark with a jealousy he didn't know how to explain. He seems nice, Cindy chirped, sensing the impending storm. He seems like a snob, Jack said, sliding back into the booth. Who noticed his ferns across the street? He was being polite, Janet said, her voice trembling slightly. Something you seem to have forgotten how to do. I'm being protected. I don't need a protector. I'm a grown woman. Janet stood up, grabbing her purse. I'm going home. Enjoy your ambience, Jack. She walked out of the Regal Beagle, leaving Jack staring at his half-empty glass. Larry patted his arm. Tough break. But hey, at least you've still got Austin. Shut up, Larry, Jack whispered. Chapter 9. The Fragrance of Jealousy. The next morning, apartment 201 smelled of roses. Not just a few roses, but dozens of them. They were everywhere, on the coffee table, the kitchen counter, even the bathroom sink. David Vance had sent them to Janet's shop, and she had brought them home. Jack emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes, only to be hit with the overwhelming scent of a funeral parlor. Did someone die? David sent them, Janet said, humming as she trimmed the stems. She looked radiant in a sundress, her hair tied back with a silk ribbon. Aren't they beautiful? Long-stemmed baccarat roses. They're ostentatious, Jack grumbled, trying to find a space on the counter to make coffee. He's trying to buy you, Janet. He's being attentive. Jack, there's a difference. Jack watched her for a moment. He wanted to say something too, tell her that he hated the roses, hated David Vance, and hated the way she looked when she talked about him. But the words felt like lead in his mouth. He was supposed to be the gay roommate. He was supposed to be the friend. If he showed his true feelings, the whole house of cards would come crashing down. I have my interview, Jack said, his voice flat. Janet paused, a rose in her hand. Right, the interview. Good luck, Jack. Thanks. He walked out of the apartment, the smell of roses clinging to his clothes like a reproach. The interview at La Casa del Sol was a disaster from the start. The owner, a stern man named Senora Rodriguez, spoke a rapid-fire Spanish that made Jack's brain freeze. "Tell me, Mr. Tripper," Rodriguez said in English, his eyes narrowing. "Why should I recommend you for a cruise ship that caters to the elite of Madrid?" Jack took a breath. He thought of Janet. He thought of David Vance and his embossed cards. He thought of the way Janet had looked at the roses. "Because," Jack said, his voice suddenly steady, "I understand the language of the kitchen. I know that a perfect sauce can say things that words can't, and I'm a man who isn't afraid of a challenge." Rodriguez stared at him for a long time. Then, he nodded slowly. "You have passion, but you're Spanish. It is mucho lousy, as you say." "I'm learning," Jack promised. "We shall see. I will give you a trial night. This Friday. A VIP party. If you can handle the pressure, I will give you the recommendation." Jack walked out of the restaurant feeling like he had won the lottery and been sentenced to death at the same time. Friday was only 3 days away. When he got back to the apartment, the roses were still there, but Janet was gone. She had a date with David Vance. Jack sat in the darkened living room, the moonlight filtering through the blinds. He picked up the Spanish textbook. "Donde está el museum?" he whispered. Then, he threw the book across the room. He didn't want the museum. He didn't want the cruise ship. He wanted the girl who lived across the hall, the one who smelled of lilies and had a temper like a summer storm. He realized then that he couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't be Austin, and he couldn't be the safe version of Jack anymore. But as he heard Janet's laughter in the hallway, returning from her date, he knew that deception was the only thing keeping them together and the one thing tearing them apart. Chapter 10. The High-Stakes Garnish. Friday arrived with a kind of oppressive heat that made the asphalt of Santa Monica shimmer. In the kitchen of La Casa del Sol, the atmosphere was even hotter. Jack stood in his whites, his forehead damp with sweat, as he prepared the paella a la Valencia. He was a whirlwind of motion-slicing peppers doucheling and muttering Spanish verbs under his breath like a frantic prayer. "Vaya a la cocina," he hissed to a busboy who got in his way. Senor Rodriguez watched from the corner, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a performance. The VIP party consisted of several executives from the cruise line, men who could decide Jack's future with a single nod. "The saffron, Jack," Rodriguez called out. "Don't be stingy, it is the soul of the dish." "I've got it, Senor," Jack yelled back, though his hands were shaking. He was doing it. He was actually doing it. Despite the pressure, despite the language barrier, the kitchen was his domain. He felt a surge of confidence he hadn't felt in weeks. But then, the door to the dining room swung open, and the hostess walked in with a look of concern. "Senor Rodriguez, we have a problem at table 4, a very particular guest." "Who is it?" Rodriguez asked. "A Mr. David Vance. He says the ambience is lacking, and the wine is insulting to his palate." Jack's heart stopped. David Vance. He peeked through the service window. There he was, sitting at a prime table in a crisp linen suit. And across from him, looking uncomfortable in a beautiful silk dress, was Janet Wood. Chapter 11. The Collision of Worlds. Jack felt like he had been doused in ice water. Janet was here. She was here with him. "Jack, the pie," Rodriguez shouted. Jack snapped back to reality, but his focus was gone. He looked at Janet through the glass. She looked bored. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, but listening to David Vance drone on about his vintage car collection. "I'm going out there," Jack whispered. "You are a chef. You stay in the kitchen." Rodriguez blocked his path. "I'm a waiter too. Remember?" Jack lied, grabbing a bottle of red wine, the most expensive one on the rack. "Table 4 needs a personal touch. I'll handle the insulting wine." He didn't wait for an answer. He burst through the swinging doors, his white coat stained with tomato sauce, his eyes burning with a mix of professional pride and personal fury. "Good evening," Jack said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone he used when he was trying not to be clumsy. Janet looked up, and her eyes widened in shock. "Jack." David Vance looked at him with disdain. "Oh, it's the roommate. Do you work here as well? I suppose the help is always more." "I'm the executive chef in training," Jack said, his jaw tight. "And I heard you had a problem with our wine." "Tragam una," bottle of vino tinto. He popped the cork with a flourish that was almost violent. He poured a glass for David, his hand steady. Try this. It's a 1974 Rioja. It has notes of leather, dark berries, and a hint of arrogance. I think you'll find it quite familiar. David took a sip, his face reddening. This is acceptable. I'm so glad, Jack said, then turned to Janet. His voice softened. And for the lady, perhaps a glass of something. Janet looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the sweat on his brow, the sauce on his apron, and the raw, undisguised emotion in his eyes. He wasn't Austin. He wasn't the gay roommate. He was just Jack. I'll have what you're having, Jack, she said quietly. Janet, really? David sighed. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, David, she said, her voice growing stronger. Jack, how is the trial going? Unsurpassed, Jack said, glancing back at Rodriguez, who was watching from the doorway with a growing sense of amusement, though I think I might have overstayed my welcome at this table. Wait, David snapped. I want the special, the pipe, and make it quick. Jack leaned in close to David, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. The pagella takes time, Mr. Vance. It's like a relationship. You can't rush it. And you certainly can't buy it. I'll make sure yours is memorable. Chapter 12. The Unraveling. The rest of the night was a blur. Jack cooked like a man possessed. He sent out the pagella for table 4 with a garnish so elaborate it looked like a botanical garden. But as he watched from the kitchen, he saw Janet stand up. She said something to David, something that made him look stunned. She didn't wait for him. She walked out of the restaurant, her head held high, leaving her wine untouched. Jack threw his apron on the counter. I'm done, senor. The job, Jack, Rodriguez called out. The cruise ship. Keep the ship, Jack shouted back, already running for the door. I've got a different destination in mind. He caught up to her on the sidewalk, the neon sign of La Casa del Sol casting a red glow over the pavement. The Santa Monica fog was starting to roll in again, cool and damp. Janet, wait. She stopped and turned around, her face streaked with tears. Why did you do that, Jack? Why did you come out there? Because I couldn't stand seeing you with him. Because he's a jerk and he doesn't deserve to be in the same room as you, let alone at the same table. And you do? She asked, her voice breaking. You, who spends all your time pretending to be someone else. You, who's planning to leave us for some boat in the Caribbean. Jack stepped closer, the space between them crackling with the electricity of years of unspoken words. I was only doing that because I thought I wasn't enough for you. I thought you wanted a stallion. I thought you wanted a cowboy or a chef or a world trip. I wanted Jack, she whispered. I've always just wanted Jack. He reached out and took her face in his hands. His fingers were still warm from the stove, his skin smelling of garlic and saffron. I'm not going on that boat, Janet, he said. The only place I want to be is in apartment 201, with you, and Cindy, and even Mr. F. He kissed her, then not a fake Austin-style kiss, but a real one. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and longing, of shared jokes and late-night snacks, of a friendship that had finally, inevitably, turned into something more. The fog swirled around them, hiding them from the world. For a moment, there was no deception, no landlords, no roommates. There was just the two of them, finally standing on solid ground. Chapter 13. The morning after. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. The roses David Vance had sent were gone, replaced by a simple jar of wildflowers Jack had picked on his way home from the pier. Jack was in the kitchen, making coffee. He wasn't studying Spanish. He was humming a disco tune, his movements light and easy. Janet walked out of her room, wearing one of Jack's old flannel shirts over her nightgown. She looked at him and smiled a slow, secret smile that made his heart skip. Good morning, he said, handing her a mug. Good morning, she replied. The front door burst open. Cindy Snow entered, her hair a mess, her eyes wide with excitement. You guys, you won't believe it. Mr. Furley just told me that his brother Bart is coming over for an inspection. We have to get ready. Jack and Janet looked at each other and burst into laughter. Let him come, Jack said, putting an arm around Janet. I think I'm done with the disguises. Are you sure, Jack? Cindy asked, confused. What about the lease? We'll figure it out, Janet said, leaning into him. Together? And as the sun rose over Santa Monica, casting long, golden shadows across the shag carpeting, they knew that whatever came next, brothers, or even cowboys, they were ready. Because in apartment 201, the best company wasn't threat, was exactly who they were meant to be. Chapter 14, The Serpent at the Gate. If Ralph Furley was a kaleidoscope of misplaced confidence, his brother Bart was a scalpel. Bart Furley didn't wear leisure suits. He wore charcoal gray wool that looked like it had been ironed with the intensity of 1,000 suns. His hair was silver, his eyes were the color of a winter sea, and he looked like a man who found joy in the fine print of a municipal code. Ralph, Bart said, stepping into the apartment and immediately checking the top of the doorframe for dust. I see the standards are as fluid as ever. Bart, good to see you, buddy. Pal. Brother, Ralph stammered, his ascot askew. The building is doing great. Profits are up. Complaints are down. Bart ignored him, his gaze fixing on Jack, who was still wearing a somewhat smug expression from his morning coffee with Janet. And these are the tenants? Bart asked, his voice cold. A florist, a secretary, and you, Mr. Tripper. Is it? Jack said, extending a hand. Nice to meet you. Bart didn't take the hand. Instead, he looked at the wildflowers on the table. Wildflowers. How rustic. Tell me, Ralph, is it common practice to allow young men to share living quarters with two attractive women in this neighborhood? Jack's special. Bart, Ralph interjected, his voice high-pitched. He's not interested in flowers. Well, except the kind Janet sells. Jack felt the old lie tighten around his neck. He looked at Janet, who was standing by the wicker chair, her knuckles white, as she gripped the armrest. He had promised to be done with disguises, but the cold, calculating look in Bart's eyes told him that the truth today would mean an eviction notice by sunset. Chapter 15. The Unbearable Weight of Truth. The inspection was a nightmare. Bart went through the apartment like a forensic investigator. He checked the plumbing, the carpet, and lingered for an uncomfortably long time at the door of Jack's bedroom. I find it curious, Bart said, standing in the center of the living room, that a young man would choose this specific arrangement. Most men of your age are looking for more traditional conquests. I like the company, Mr. Furley, Jack said, trying to summon the safe persona, but finding it increasingly difficult after the night he had just spent with Janet. Every time he looked at her, he remembered the taste of the fog and the heat of her kiss. And you, Miss Wood. Bart turned his icy gaze to Janet. You find Mr. Tripper's presence acceptable. No concerns about propriety. No late night complications. Janet took a breath. She looked at Jack, and for a second, she was tempted to tell the truth. To tell Bart that Jack was the most decent, talented, and wonderful man she had ever known, and that she didn't care about the lease. He's my best friend, Janet said, her voice steady. And he's the best roommate we could ask for. He makes us laugh. He makes us feel safe. And he makes a mean. That's all the propriety we need. Bart narrowed his eyes. Ah, how charming, Ralph. I want to see the basement now. As the Furley brothers exited, the apartment felt like it had been sucked of its air. Jack collapsed onto the sofa. He knows. I swear, he knows. He suspects, Cindy said, coming out from the shadows of the kitchen. But he can't prove anything. Unless what? Jack asked. Unless Austin comes back, Cindy suggested with a mischievous glint in her eye. No! Jack and Janet shouted in unison. Chapter 16. The Final Showdown. The afternoon was a tense waiting game. Ralph came back upstairs, looking like he had been put through a meat grinder. Bart wants to have dinner here tonight. He says he wants to see the real dynamic of the building management's flagship apartment. Dinner, tonight. Jack stood up, his professional instincts kicking in. I don't have enough saffron. I don't have... Forget the saffron, Jack, Ralph pleaded. Just make something normal. And for heaven's sake, be gay. Be gayer than a chorus line at the Hollywood Bowl. The dinner was a masterclass in awkwardness. Jack served a simple roast chicken, but his nerves were frayed. He kept catching Bart, looking at the way Janet handed him the salt, or the way Jack's hand lingered near hers when he poured the wine. You seem very attentive to Miss Wood, Jack, Bart noted, his fork poised mid-air, for a man who was supposed to be uninterested. I'm attentive to everyone, Jack said, his voice a little too high. asked Cindy. Cindy, am I attentive? Oh, very, Cindy chirped, almost knocking over her water. He noticed my new earrings immediately. Bart smiled, a thin, predatory expression. I've seen this before. Ralph, you are a fool. You've let a fox into the henhouse. Mr. Tripper is no more gay than I am, and I'm going to make sure the board of directors hears about this breach of contract. The room went silent. Ralph looked at Jack with a desperate, pleading gaze. Jack looked at Janet. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing their home, their sanctuary. But he also saw the woman who had kissed him in the fog, the woman who had chosen his wildflowers over David Vance's expensive roses. He stood up, slowly, and took off his apron. You're right, Bart, Jack said, his voice calm and low. Jack, no, Ralph whimpered. I'm not gay, Jack continued, ignoring Ralph. I'm a man who fell in love with his roommate, and I'm a man who is tired of lying to people like you just to have a place to live. He turned to Janet. I love this apartment. I love these girls. But I love you more than I love a lease agreement. Janet stood up, her eyes shining. And I love him, Bart. Evict us if you want, but you can't evict the truth. Chapter 17. The Twist of Fate. Bart Furley stood up, his face reddening with a mix of triumph and indignation. Well, there it is, Ralph. Prepared the paperwork. This unit will be vacant by the 1st of the month. But Ralph Furley didn't move. He stood up, his chest puffed out, his bruised plum leisure suit actually looking a bit dignified for the first time. No, Ralph said. Bart blinked. Excuse me. I said no. Bart, you aren't evicting anyone. This is my building. You might be the serpent of the board, but I'm the manager, and I'm telling you that Jack Tripper is the best tenant I've ever had. He's my friend. You're choosing these deviants over your own brother, Bart hissed. I'm choosing my family over a bully, Ralph said, his voice firm. Now, get out of my building, Bart, before I call the police, and tell them about that little tax discrepancy you mentioned in the basement. Bart frozen. He looked at Ralph, then at the three young people standing together. He realized he had lost. Without a word, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. Then it was broken by a collective cheer. Ralph, you did it, Jack shouted, hoisting the landlord into the air. I did, didn't I? Ralph laughed, his ascot finally falling off. Wait, what tax discrepancy? I don't know, Jack admitted, setting him down. I just hoped you were bluffing. I was, Ralph winked, but don't tell Bart. As the night settled over Santa Monica, the three roommates and their landlord sat around the table, eating the remains of the roast chicken. There were no more disguises, no more Austin, no more eyeliner. Jack reached under the table and found Janet's hand. She squeezed back. So, Janet whispered, what now? Now, Jack said, looking at her with a warmth that could melt the Pacific fog. We live for real. And as the disco lights of a nearby club reflected in the window, apartment 201 was no longer just a sanctuary, it was home. Chapter 18. The Third Wheel's Waltz. The week following the Great Furley Showdown was a blur of domestic bliss and awkward transitions. Jack and Janet were no longer just roommates, they were a couple, and the apartment, once a neutral zone of shared chores and playful banter, had become a minefield of romantic tension. Jack would accidentally brush against Janet's hand while passing the orange